So I'm really happy to have you all here today. On behalf of University of Southern California Center for Economic and Social Research, Innovations for Poverty Action, Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, and IDRC, I want to extend a very warm welcome to everybody in the audience, panelists, and IDRC who supported the work that we'll be presenting today. I'm Anisha. I'm the research director for Busara and your moderator for this afternoon, evening, morning, early morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. So yeah, I think we're just gonna go ahead and get started. I see we have quite a few participants in already, and we're just at about time. So on the topic today, as simple as this may sound, true financial inclusion means that financial services are inclusive for everyone, women and men. But although that sounds simple, it's of course, we're still not completely there in designing or implementing products and platforms that address and accommodate women's different lived experiences. Until pretty recently, financial inclusion assumed that access to banks or saving groups automatically led to inclusion of more women. However, that left out the constraints in design, usability, structural, cultural factors that have resulted in an extended and persistent global gender gap in inclusion. So what we hope to focus on today is a shift toward gender transformative approaches to financial services that challenge this systemic inequality. For me, gender transformative financial services is both a process as well as a set of outcomes. On one hand, it's the way of increasing inclusion explicitly geared towards gender equal financial systems. And on the other, it also represents a set of outcomes such as empowerment, negotiation dynamics, enabling policies and social norms. So gender transformative financial services is about making financial systems women able rather than just making women bankable. Through presentations and discussions today on various research studies conducted across Tanzania, Kenya, and Zambia, we hope to tackle this question of what gender transformative finance really means, how close or far we are from achieving this truly inspirational goal, and sort of where that leaves us thinking about research, implementation, and policy for 2021. Similar to other webinar formats, since we're all pretty used to this now, we'll be starting by hearing from our panelists today on the research they've been conducting in the area. We'll then move to a discussion section and invite questions from the audience. Please, everybody, use the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen to send in your questions. You can send in the questions at any point of time, but we do have dedicated time to address them as part of the agenda. We'll close at the end hearing from Dr. Martha from IDRC on her reflections on the session, her thoughts for the agenda for 2021, and hopefully she'll leave us all with some food for thought for the day. So yeah, with that, as you said, to understand how to actually make financial services gender transformative, obviously a first step is conducting research on the ground, measuring impact, and trying to understand how that can inform design. One thing we often don't talk about enough is the implementation challenges that occur while trying to implement interventions and collect data. And more often than not, these challenges are actually very similar to those faced by financial service providers on the ground who are also trying to onboard women onto various platforms. So Caroline, I think we'd love to hear from you as a research lead at IPA, where you manage a portfolio of impact evaluations on a range of topics from financial inclusion, women's economic empowerment, employment, health, education, and specifically on this study that you've led the implementation of in Tanzania. What are some of the implementation challenges you faced? What sort of tweaks have you made to make it more gender friendly? And what do you think these mean for making financial services more gender transformative as a whole?
Unmute myself and then share my screen. Whoops. That's good, right? Let's see. Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thanks. All right, so thank you for that introduction. And then I'll just quickly introduce the principal investigators on this study, Nathan Fiala, who's on the panel, and Catherine Schuss and Rachel Steinacre at IPA, who are implementing this research with IPA. So I'll start just by giving a background on the e-savings study, what we did, our design, and then get into kind of some of the implementation challenges that we faced on the ground. So, and as you mentioned, a primary objective of all three of these studies we'll hear from today is to provide insights on how to achieve gender transformative financial inclusion. So beyond just provision of access to finance, but really going to get a transformative change. And so the e-savings study is a randomized controlled trial that's exploring the role of inter-household bargaining in achieving that objective. So it is a study that tests how providing access to a financial product while moderating potential social constraints that are potentially preventing full utilization of that product can improve financial inclusion and labor market choices for our study respondents. Ultimately, we hope to engage and leverage partnerships with private sector actors to promote and scale interventions that we find to yield significant impacts. So to boil it down, how do we do that? We are asking, can gender-targeted financial inclusion intervention, an intervention that provides a safe place for women to save and more financial control, help women save more? And moreover, can a household training on household kind of financial management actually reshape the actual intra-household dynamics that are going on to in turn help women save more? So how do we do this? Our study targets enrollment of around 4,000 women. To be eligible for enrollment, we have women who are 18 years of age or older, married and in a non-polygamous marriage, currently unbanked. She must possess a mobile phone and have a government ID that's acceptable for bank account opening. Among these women, around 600 are screened in what we call pure control markets, so no chance of receiving an intervention. And then the remainder are randomly assigned to either a control group, also no intervention, or one of 3 treatment arms. The first treatment arm, women receive a private e-bank and savings account, which only she can access. In the second treatment arm, women receive an account and we announce this account. Husbands are made aware of the account. And then in the third treatment arm, women receive this bank account and she is invited to attend an in-person 2-day training on household decision-making and financial management along with her husband. And I should note that anyone in a treatment group who receives a bank account is also provided with approximately $5 in seed savings. So that's a study, and I should note that we're approximately halfway through reaching our baseline sample. We had to pause field work earlier this year due to COVID-19. But before that, some implementation challenges and lessons. So I'll focus on 2, both of which have to do with developing strategies and implementing field plans to efficiently deliver treatment and ensure treatment take-up. I think both of which are essential to our CTs and our ability to generate well-powered impact estimates. So the first challenge was how and really where do we most efficiently find, enroll, and deliver an intervention to eligible participants, considering that participants' ability to fulfill KYC requirements, know your customer requirements, is a prerequisite for study enrollment. So if we're providing a bank account as our treatment, we need to be certain that she can open that account, have one opened in her name. So of course, a key KYC requirement is proper identification. In Tanzania, and for the account we were providing, this could be a national ID card, a voter registration card, driver's license, or passport. We began by screening and enrolling women in our study in markets, places where we knew we could find many women who were engaged in small micro businesses. Finding women with proper identification wasn't so much the challenge, but it was finding women who had the ID on them. So ID ownership is quite common in Tanzania, and we found that around 86% of the women we screened indicated they had an ID, but it was only 30% of them who had an ID on the spot at this initial screening. And this was an issue because we needed to be certain that the ID was valid, could be verified, and used by our banking partners to provide the bank account. So what we did was kind of quickly adapt our field plan, screening survey, data flow to be able to identify women who met all of our eligibility criteria, had the ID, but had it at home and were willing to bring it the next day, and then assigned a specific group of enumerators to track those women intensely. You know, we knew they were eligible and interested, but we were kind of missing this key criteria. We found this to be relatively efficient and successfully follow up with some women, but I think a loss to follow up wasn't so surprising. About 64% of the women we followed up with did indeed bring their ID the next day. In addition to that, and thinking about other ways we could address this challenge, we earlier this year piloted a strategy whereby we were screening women for enrollment in, not in markets, but in mixed use residential and business wards, hypothesizing that if a woman didn't have the ID on her in her place of work, she could more easily and quickly retrieve it from home. Our initial piloting suggested that this was going to improve our survey kind of efficiency rates, but we did have to pause field work as a result of COVID shortly after implementing this strategy. So ultimately, I think here with this challenge, there are two lessons. The first, from an implementation point of view, being that it's important to think about a lot of things when developing a field plan and weigh different criteria. You know, the advantage of working in a market was where we had many women who met almost all of our eligibility criteria, yet there was this key constraint that prevented us from, that was creating a bottleneck for enrolling more women. And I think at kind of a higher level, there are possibly implications for where financial service providers or mobile banking agents can most efficiently and effectively target new customers. They are going around places to find new customers and might run into some of the same challenges that we did. And then a second challenge that I wanted to address that I think was possibly even more significant was how to encourage male participation in our household training intervention. So we initially planned to deliver this training in a group setting at or near the markets where we were enrolling women. They were going to be held during the day, but at times that were specifically, business would be relatively slow in the types of business that our respondents were running, and we would provide an inconvenience fee to make up for the time spent with us at the training. And in all of these ways, the training was convenient for our study participants. And qualitative and anecdotal evidence from similar studies had suggested that people respond well to this type of training, men included. But despite that, and despite our own piloting that had suggested that we weren't going to run into much trouble getting women to bring their husbands to this training intervention, pretty early on in data collection, we found that this was a challenge. We were seeing participant attendance rates of around average of 72%, but the percentage of their husbands who were attending at least one day together with their wife was as low as 20 to 25% in some of our first survey areas, especially in Dar es Salaam, the most urban area where we were working. And the thing was that we were finding that people who attended one day came to the second day, and anecdotally they were enjoying the training, but the challenge was getting people there. So again, we kind of quickly brought our field team together to brainstorm strategies for increasing attendance. And what we found through these discussions were that while we were holding the trainings at a time that was and location that was convenient for our women, our participants, some husbands had been working prohibitively far away. This is especially the case in urban centers. Additionally, some participants' husbands worked in jobs that didn't allow them to come. So this could be a full-time salary job, but could also be casual jobs for which the opportunity cost of attending was just too high. And lastly, while we were framing this training around money management and income growth, there was still a perception that it was meant for women. So I should say that given the low attendance, we did determine there was a need to increase the sample size to maintain power, but we also tweaked the intervention delivery to increase attendance by doing things like holding trainings at places of residence at times that were more convenient, like evenings and weekends, to make it more convenient for both men and women. We also were quite nimble in scheduling this around times that were convenient for individual couples rather than groups, which is a departure from our original plan. And then lastly, created materials to be used for publicity that were more professional grade to kind of increase the perceived value of this training. So again, we were set to try out some of these new strategies kind of earlier this year and then had to pause fieldwork due to COVID, but our early piloting did suggest that these strategies in combination with this census approach to sampling would lead to higher attendance. So we're looking forward to seeing how those pan out when we resume fieldwork. And ultimately, I think both of these just speak to some of the challenges that come with implementing complex surveys and interventions. So with that, I think I'm at my time, so I'll turn it back to you, Anisha.
Great, thank you for sharing, Caroline. I think the point you made on the digital IDs was super interesting, right? Because if you look at like FinAccess or any of the reports, it seems like the gender gap in ID ownership is really small. But then when you actually go to the field and like use that ID to be onboarded onto financial services, there are so many different ways that we need to, considerations that we need to keep in mind in the ways we collect data and the information needed, especially for financial services that might differ. Simone, I'd like to bring you in now as a assistant professor of economics at the University of Southern California. A lot of your research focuses on household decision-making, financial access, innovation for the unbanked, health-seeking behavior, gender, all of that. And of course, you've worked in a number of countries as well. What do you think the sort of state of gender transformative finance is today? A lot of your research takes this sort of mixed method approach, which also looks at how women perceive transformativeness of finance. We'd love to hear from you based on your study in Kenya. What has your research shown so far? And how do you think we can really harness mixed methods to maybe either tackle some of the problems Caroline might have faced or just define this agenda clearly?
All right, great. And I'm going to assume that you can see my slides and hear me, and
yes,
you will tell me
perfect.
if that is not the case. Great. So thanks so much. I will say in terms of the mixed methods, I really can't take credit for this, and that this is joint work with two other colleagues of mine at USC, Jeremy Burke, who is an economist, as well as Leela Rabinovich, who is an anthropologist, and led that part of the project. But it was really fun for me, and I learned a lot. I think Anisha motivated this idea of gender transformative finance really well, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. But as a jumping off point for our project, we took this definition, which comes from a framing paper that the IDRC supported, written by Saskia Vossenberg Hall, which is this idea of we're looking to financial services, not just to help women save and maybe smooth some shocks and do the sort of typical economic stuff that we think of as economists, but also something much more holistic, right? They define it as enhanced capabilities of poor women to improve their livelihoods, to tackle adverse norms and rules that undermine shared control and decision making. And so when thinking about this project, we had to think about what does that mean for the types of outcomes we would like to learn about. And so in addition to the traditional economic stuff, we sort of think about what's happening with women within their households in terms of autonomy, agency, decision-making power, how their husbands perceive them, what's happening personally in terms of the way that you see yourself, your goals, your aspirations, your mental health, your self-efficacy, and also, kind of more socio-political and community outcomes in terms of, how connected are you to your peers in your community? Do you have a network? And, are you kind of participating in like political structures that make important decisions for culture? So this is a pretty big ask. It's a lot of stuff. And you'll see that, we're sort of differentially able to speak to some of these outcomes, but that's kind of the motivation in the background. I think for this group, why to pursue a gender transformative agenda in terms of both financial inclusion and research is probably intuitive to many of you, but, really the vision here is to think about the sustainable development goals, right? We want to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, not just because it's good for economic growth and prosperity, but, this is really a question of fundamental human rights. And the financial services space offers some important opportunities. We've made great progress in recent years in terms of getting people banked. And as the availability of digital financial services increase in low-income countries, we kind of expect to be able to make more progress. But if you look at kind of across many, many different studies, often what you see, especially in terms of the economic impacts, is it seems like men are benefiting more than women, not always, but often. And we know that women kind of have lower financial capability. This may become especially important when we start to move towards perhaps more tech-driven interventions. So we want to make sure that future growth, kind of favors and lifts up women, but at the same time, a lot of the evidence focuses on a very narrow set of those non-economic outcomes. And I think the reality is we don't know what what a lot of these products are really doing for women when we kind of take this more holistic approach. So what we do in this project is, start with, and what I'll tell you about first is a quantitative piece, which is really aiming to understand the gender impacts of mobile money and M-Pesa in Kenya rolled out at scale. So kind of close a little bit of that evidence gap. And we followed up with a qualitative piece, which Leela led, which is to really add a lot of nuance and color in the lines of a lot of the stuff that the quantitative analysis is going to be missing, kind of starting from this initial point of saying, like, how do women define welfare? As economists, we have our own opinions, perhaps, or you may have your own opinion, but what are women trying to achieve when they start using financial services? And, what is their definition of success? And how do they see these different financial services contributing? And how might that inform our hypotheses about what types of services are going to be beneficial and what types of outcomes we should be looking at as researchers when we're trying to understand what makes positive change for women? So starting with the quantitative use, just to quickly motivate, this is a hard thing to study at scale. And that if you look at differences between, say, women who use mobile money and women who don't, this is in Kenya in 2015 for the Financial Sector Deepening Household Survey, you can see that mobile money users and non-users are really different, right? Kind of 70% of users have graduated primary, whereas only 28% non-users have. Users are much more likely to live in urban areas. I could give you many different characteristics, but the idea here is to really just motivate this fact that we can't just look at the outcomes of women who are using particular financial services like mobile money and attribute those differences to the service itself, right? That people that adopt these products may be different to begin with. And that's why, folks like myself and Caroline, Nathan, Nava do randomized control trials. We're going to kind of try to solve this sort of through what we call a quasi-experimental approach because we're kind of looking to study the rollout of an actual product in a country at scale. And the way that we're going to do that is to build on existing literature that has looked at kind of early mobile money rollout in Kenya. M-Pesa, you're probably all well familiar with, is a tremendously successful product. And what I'm plotting on the left-hand side here is just the growth in the number of mobile money outlets starting in 2007. That's the year that the product first started, all the way through 2015. And if we look at some of the earlier research by Tadnit Suri and Billy Jack on this, they provide a lot of compelling evidence that that early growth in M-Pesa was actually like pretty random, in part because Safaricom just really wanted to scale up their network super fast, and they, you know, had many different places they could go, and so there wasn't a ton of consideration put into where they went, whereas, you know, kind of later growth was much more strategic. So we're going to study that exact same rollout. But we're going to take a slightly different approach, which is called differences and differences. And if you're not a quantitative person, like, don't worry about this slide. But if you're into those details, I wanted to give you an idea of what we were doing. You know, essentially what we say is these places that got kind of early mobile money growth between 2007 and 2010 will allow them to kind of be different from the low growth areas to begin with. But what we're going to assume is that those trends, the paths that those two places were on, would have been the same were it not for the rollout of mobile money. And that'll allow us to kind of identify the effect by looking for trend breaks after that growth period has ended. And I kind of want to show you a picture of, you know, kind of how this works in practice. And this is also nice because we have lots of pre-period data, so we can kind of test the assumption at the same time, which is to look at kind of shifts in high versus low mobile money growth areas in a different financial service, which is banking outlets. And so the first thing we say is like, okay, you know, how are these high and low growth areas different in terms of bank density in 2000, you know, kind of way before mobile money happened? And then we say, how do those differences change over time? You know, do we really kind of see this no trend break assumption in practice? And, you know, kind of, I'm graphing that here. You can kind of see the red line is the sort of shift in the trend. And you see what you would hope to see, which is that this is really close to zero, kind of leading up to that mobile money period. So that's good for us. You know, then you can kind of see this growth period between 2007 and 2010. And then after 2010, there's this big increase in the number of banking agents in these areas that saw high early mobile money growth. And that actually makes a lot of sense because in 2010, Kenya legalized agency banking models, and a lot of people who are working as M-Pesa agents, you know, could then also start working as a banking agent. So part of what you know, this rollout did is actually laid the groundwork to support agency banking. And that observation is important because all the effects that I'm about to show you are really telling you the effect, like the total bundled effect of early access to mobile money. And that's going to kind of include everything, like that maybe saying, okay, that's the effect then of also having additional banking agents, you know, that's the effect of stimulating additional local economic activity, so on and so forth. It's really like a net effect. And from a policy perspective, you can kind of think of it as, it's really good for informing us about like the effect of a financial inclusion policy itself. It's not really going to tell us the effect for an individual of using versus not using. Okay, so just to kind of show you how we measure the effects. If you understand this graph, you're going to be good to go for the rest of the slides, and it'll be very fast. So to put our effects in context, what I'm doing is I'm graphing the average outcome for women in no growth areas in 2010. You can kind of think of this as the baseline. This first example is just the share of people in, you know, kind of the post-2010 period, share of women that were using mobile money. You can see about 45% of women in those no growth areas were using mobile money, you know, because of course it expanded kind of virally throughout the country. And then what we can do is a thought experiment of saying, okay, like that area had kind of experienced kind of average early growth. How would that outcome have changed? And you know, what we estimate is that mobile money use in the post period would have been about 4 percentage points higher if they had kind of gotten average growth, which would be 1 agent per 2,000 people in a local area. So we do see that if you get mobile money, you're more likely to be a user in later periods. But at the same time, we don't see any impact on women's use of other financial services, including informal services. And so what this is telling us is that mobile money was kind of filling a new need, but it wasn't substituting, you know, women out of using other financial services that they would have been using otherwise. In terms of women's economic outcomes, what we see is very similar to Tevnit and Billy's early work, is that there is a substitution. You know, women start engaging in self-employment more,
And this comes at the expense of wage work, which you should really think of as including both, kind of formal wage jobs, but also like casual labor, right? Where you're doing work for daily wage. Women are less likely to be engaging in that, more likely to be self-employed, a little bit more likely to work in agriculture, actually, by 2 percentage points. But there's actually no change in the share of women who report doing work for pay in the past year. So it's really a substitution in terms of what working women do. They're also like less likely to be poor, as defined as having a small number of household assets in the demographic and health survey, which is good. Women are in these sort of high growth areas are about 4.5 percentage points more likely to be economically resilient, which is an outcome that we define based on kind of saying somebody was never had to go without things like food, essential medicines, and housing for the entire year, right? So people are more likely to avoid those really negative shocks when they get early access for mobile money. And another thing that we found kind of striking is that women in these high growth areas are 5 percentage points more likely to say that they feel safe from crime in their home. It's actually hard to interpret that outcome. It could reflect broader social changes, but it could also reflect the fact that I feel safer, kind of given all the dynamics that are happening in my household. At the same time, though, we turn to a different survey to kind of look at impacts on gender-based violence itself. We see no changes in gender-based violence, but we do see that women in high mobile money growth areas are 2.5 percentage points more likely to say that gender-based violence is never justified when presented with a bunch of scenarios like, is it okay to beat your wife if she burns the food or neglects the kids, so on and so forth. So it does seem that there's a little bit of a shift in this social norm about how appropriate GBV might be. And also strikingly, we sort of say, we look at a series of questions in the demographic and health survey that ask women, kind of, do you have input on a variety of household decisions, like, whether or not you get to go visit your family, how making large household expenditures, so on and so forth. We see a 4 percentage point increase in the share of women who say, yes, I'm involved in all of those decisions, kind of relative to a base that's a bit under 50%. And what's interesting is we actually see a similar question for men in the demographic and health survey. Men are reporting less decision agency. It's starting from a very high mean, right? It's like 45% for women, 90% of men say they have a say in large household purchases, and that actually goes down in these high growth areas. So what that's really suggesting that part of what mobile money is doing is kind of shifting a little bit of the balance of power within the household away from men and towards women. So that's all I have for the quant. You should feel free to ask questions later, but what I want to tell you about now is those are kind of, it's a scattered set of outcomes. Like those were the gender relevant outcomes that we were able to identify in data sets that let us do the analysis. But you might want to kind of fill that in with a little more color from what women say themselves. And so what I want to share with you are results from 90 semi-structured interviews that we did with women across Kenya. We kind of did this following a series of focus groups with about 90 women to really, kind of understand what some of the relevant themes might be. These are women that live in 3 different parts of Kenya. Siaya County, which is, these women are pretty rural, and 68% of them have primary education or less, as well as women in low-income areas in Nairobi. And then women in Kilifi County as well, which again is, more rural, and those women actually have the least amount of education on average. So the first thing we did when we started our interviews was to ask women to reflect on what well-being meant to them. We did this by kind of saying, what are your goals and aspirations in life? Like, how do you define a good life, which is a phrase that resonated with people. And the number one thing that people mentioned was basically economic well-being, like having enough money and being able to put food on the table. That was really, really top of mind for women. You can see that in this quote at the bottom. She says, like, I will have a good life if I can get things easily, if I don't have to beg, having my own cash without having to ask anybody else. That wasn't the only thing that women mentioned. You know, other themes that came out really frequently were things like making sure my kids are kind of educated, living in a good quality house, and being healthy. But it was really, really about basic needs. That's where women's heads were at. And you know, so you can kind of think of like that's sort of what women are kind of trying to do or trying to improve when they use financial services. And then we kind of ask them what financial services do for them. And one of the things we saw was that, you know, they don't kind of, we saw basically no stories of women saying, you know, I started using X financial service product, it completely changed my life. Now I'm so much wealthier and everything is so different. But really what financial services are doing for women are helping them manage these small amounts of money that really let them procure and get essentials when they need it. And I think one of the things that I really learned in doing this is that kind of begets a sort of autonomy and shift that can be quite meaningful, even though the changes appear to be small. You know, women will kind of say, you know, before I was totally dependent on my husband, but like now he sees me as an independent person. You know, I can kind of help the household by taking some money, taking some loans when we need things. You know, I can pay for my school kids. And this really meant a lot to women. You know, there can be some negative consequences in terms of it causing stress within the household. But those shifts were important, and it kind of also translated into, you know, kind of broader impacts in the way that women see them, right? You know, I think this one woman, for example, says, you know, when I joined Autonomy, which is this like group savings arrangement, like my life changed, like I'm not useless, I have class now, you can't tell me I am down right now. And those group savings arrangements were also really important for women in terms of just building social connections that were a source of support, right? This other woman says, like, being in this group savings arrangement, or this group savings and lending arrangement has improved my social life because I can share things with people. You know, for instance, my husband beats me, I can go to the trauma and we talk about it. When you share such things, you realize, you know, you're not the only one going through hardship. And, you know, the way that I interpret some of the things that women are saying is like, that's a pretty big deal. I think if you reflect on it for yourself. And, you know, this is something that I think as economists running quantitative surveys, you know, we often do a really garbage job of measuring, to be honest. And so when I kind of think about what this means in terms of final thoughts is, you know, there's kind of two pieces from these somewhat disparate research streams. In terms of the quantitative analysis, what I find very encouraging, I think one of the things I'd be interested in talking about in the discussion is this idea of like scale and how should we think about scale, right? And M-Pesa is like a mass marketed, super successful financial service that has no gender agenda, right? It is not gender targeted, it's not necessarily thinking about, you know, women, but because it's sort of filling this really fundamental economic need, it helps women a lot, and it has gendered outcomes, which is really encouraging. You know, but at the same time, I think, you know, what we see from the qual analysis, and there's so much stuff in there, you should read the report, which is on our website. I didn't have time to talk about. There's a lot of needs within the formal sector that like women are just like not kind of getting the benefits of, say, you know, what they get out of informal services. And a lot of those benefits of just giving women a little bit of independence or connecting them with a set of peers who can serve as a support group are really, really valuable for kind of just like informing women's non-economic well-being. So stop there.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you, Simone. And I think a lot of people have already streamed in asking if the paper is available or if they can see the slides somewhere else. So that's a good sign. Maybe you can just post the link to the paper in the chat if possible. But I think that thank you for sharing that. And like some of them are preliminary study findings, so thank you so much. I think for what stood out to me was the one on shifting bargaining power within the household. And it's always interesting that we look at the household as a unit and consider the manner in which decisions are made within each household is not always a linear process, right? Rather a result of evaluating conflicting priorities, and these decisions are usually influenced by the rest of the household's choices. And that sort of forms this intricate series of decisions and costs. And at the end of the day, no household is the same either. So these decision-making processes shift from household to household as well. And that sort of makes shifting the norm and focusing on agency and, as you said, aspiration so much more important. And what it made me think of was that generally we make this distinction between personal life and professional lives. And I think maybe we all do it much more easily for ourselves than for women in these settings. And it's not always possible to actually separate out personal and professional lives, especially in the contexts we work with. And therefore, social norms and household factors end up playing a large role in women's businesses and entrepreneurship and drive towards being businesswomen as well. So I think, Nava, connecting that, I'd love to hear from you as a professor at the Department of Economics and the research director at the Marshall Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science. You've led a lot of research efforts to inspire private action for public good and with a focus on maximizing impact. So what are sort of the universe of factors from a structural as well as household perspective that you think could influence, or you found that has influenced business growth for women, which are in addition to sort of the challenges of financial access? And how do you think these challenges come together? And how can we address them together to make financial services truly transformative?
Wonderful. Thank you, Anisha, for that intro. And thank you to the other panelists. Let me just see if you can see my screen. Can everyone see the screen?
Yeah. Yes, perfect.
Great. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here and really grateful to our donor, IDRC, who has helped to make this work possible that I'm sharing with you today, as well as to bringing us together, these other Caroline and Nathan and Simone and Lila, and the work that has a lot of overlaps. You'll see them exactly. I mean, for example, the finding that Simone and Lila had about the value that some of these informal financial services give to women far beyond the credit. That's actually something that we found resonates very strongly in Zambia as well. And some of the intra-household dynamics that both panelists have brought up. So I'm excited also for our joint conversation after this. But to kind of tell you a little bit about what we've been doing in Zambia, I'm going to present some quantitative evidence, some large-scale survey evidence, as well as some of the more qualitative insights that we've been gaining on the ground. And in line with the theme of really trying to go beyond just simply access to finance and really understand the underlying dynamics that are gendered, we're going to be focusing a lot on the sort of risks of expropriation that have resonated across the couple of years that we've been doing this work with female entrepreneurs. So actually, I wanted to start with, this is a graphic from the 1800s from the US, and it actually was in when I was a professor at Harvard Business School, it was in my building, and it was sort of meant to be about the importance of trust among men for commercial activity. And of course, we understand that trust is an important aspect of economic growth, and man's confidence in man is obviously been crucial for the development of financial services for commercial activity. In developed countries and in developing countries, in fact, you find that across the world, trust in itself is low, and then trust among women for both others and for institutions is also low, probably for good reason, actually, simply because of these risks for expropriation. So just to give you a quick sense from the World Values Survey around the world, you see that actually in Africa, where we're all working, trust is actually among its lowest. And then among women, it's low globally. And these resonate tremendously, as you're about to see, in Zambia and in Lusaka, where we've been working in Zambia. And that is not a sort of characteristic that is irrational. That is something that is in response to the kind of rational fears of expropriation when one trusts. And you'll see this sort of over and over again. And so let me link it for you now, this aspect of trust, of man's confidence in man, and especially as we think about women now, with the aspects of lending and finance that are natural for those of us who are interested in that, and commercial activity. So the data I'm about to show you comes from a large-scale census that we did. This is a geocode of all of Lusaka. Lusaka is one of the fastest growing cities in the world and in sub-Saharan Africa. And we interviewed thousands of entrepreneurs. I'm going to show you results from a more intensive survey that we did with 2,000 entrepreneurs within the manufacturing sector, which is a sector that really rewards collaboration and credit because there are significant economies of scale. So there's a lot of money being left on the table if people aren't able to find credit for their activities and collaborate. And I'll show you what the results look like by men versus women. And actually, as I show you this, let me stress that, in fact, everything that I show you, all of the results are going to come from our data in Lusaka, but they are completely resonant in the global data on entrepreneurship, especially in developing countries. So in our data, as well as around the world, women are concentrating in the least profitable sectors within manufacturing. So 75% of women work in apparel, 18% in food manufacturing. The reason often given for that is preferences or training. That's not necessarily the case that we've seen, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Women have lower sales than men. That often comes from where they're focusing, but also how they're doing their work. Sales in good weeks are, in our case, $226 US for men and $130 US for women. Women's firms are smaller than men. To complement this with qualitative work, when we've talked to women business owners, they say that they often can't trust, again, people to be able to leave them in charge of their business, and they're not listened to as well as to be the boss of others. So men have on average 1.05 full-time employees, women have 0.6. Crucially, the two genders learn their trade differently. 75% of men learn from other entrepreneurs or family. 40% of women do. So the majority of women who are in entrepreneurship and allowing the economic growth that can occur, that is available to them, are relying on formal training channels to be able to learn. And this, we asked the same World Value Survey question that I showed you from around the world. And indeed, we find the same results in Lusaka. 10% of men versus 4% of women believe that most people can be trusted. So it's very low trust. That has to do with kind of the reality on the ground and the role of institutions, which I'll talk about in a second. These gaps in entrepreneurship, you can see them very clearly as well in the activities that take part that are crucial to economies of scale and to growth of small businesses. So that is joint buying, so that you can get a lower price. Women do that less than men. Lending and borrowing. But on the lending front in particular, this is really important because when we think about gender transformative finance, there is an economy of lending and borrowing, and the lending aspect also requires contract enforcement, which is more difficult for women to get enforced. Advice, as you saw, sharing orders, and on average cooperation. These aspects of cooperation in collaboration in business activity are significantly correlated both with the trust measures that I mentioned and sales in a good week. Okay. And I also wanted to just encourage you also, as we're talking, to add questions into the Q&A. I have my wonderful co-author, Alexia Delfino, who's assistant professor at Bocconi, who's on the panelist, and of course we'll answer questions afterwards too, but feel free to include them in the chat as well. Okay, so now I want to add one more layer to this. So women are not doing this in isolation, right? And all entrepreneurs are doing their activity, economic activity, with others. And now we haven't talked about the household yet. I'll get to that in a second. But they are embedded in a network of other entrepreneurs, which you saw here, in terms of who they're buying from, who they're lending from, et cetera. They're also embedded often, almost always, in markets. And we really try to think about these market dynamics that help to provide some form of contract enforcement and sort of substitute for the trust that might be difficult to obtain individually. So these are 84 markets in Lusaka, they're often led by market chiefs that are a local person that helps to protect the interests of the marketeers that are part of the market. And so if you have a market dispute, so someone bought another marketer's machine but didn't pay for the machine, or often is it the case that someone puts in an order for the women but doesn't come and pick up the order, or the woman lends out some money, he doesn't pay her back, etc. The chief comes in and resolves the dispute. And we use the data I just showed you in terms of the geocoded to look at people who are based within the market as well as just outside of the market. And we control actually for business density and area fixed effects and everything else you can imagine. And what we find is that female-owned owners that are located within a market compared to a woman that's just outside the market cooperate more in all the activities we talk about and have higher sales. And so we ask sort of how much, to be able to understand these underlying dynamics and the kind of the way in which this aspect of security helps, we ask how much of this effect is coming from the chief's protection. Of course, we can't separate out in this analysis what's correlational and what's actually causal. So what we do is a lab in the field experiment with all of the entrepreneurs in these markets. That's a modified form of what you may have seen before as a trust and investment game. And actually the marketeers found this sometimes it can be a little bit artificial to do these lab in the field experiments. I think people found it very consistent with lending and borrowing money, for example. And so what you do, and in particular in the context of business investments. And so one player gets a certain sum of money. So we had 480 participants across 16 marketplaces. And then it gets tripled. It gets doubled in our case. And then you can decide how much to return. And it's anonymous who you give it to. And we kind of implement the whole thing for them. And so they don't know who the next party is, but in some cases, they have access to a market chief who will be able to resolve any disputes if they believe that they were not treated fairly. So let me show you in the control group. So in a general, nothing, no institutions, nothing, how are women and men behaving? So this is very consistent with the World Values Survey results that I showed you earlier. Women in the control group trust less, they send less money. What that means is not only that they are sending less money, but there's less money available in the overall pie for in this case, commercial activity. And what we think is consistent with a lot of the other work in experimental economics, that individuals are bringing their past experiences to bear while playing these games. And what we find is that when you add the ability for chiefs to make judgments that are unbiased, so we don't tell them who it is in the market that is bringing the dispute forward. When they know that they have access to someone who can protect their interests, it increases the amounts they send, and that actually increases the pie for everyone that is available. We see similar results with access to a small claims court, which is one that is not as familiar and is not as kind of localized an institution, but could potentially allow for a greater pie to be available through ensuring the security for women who are kind of are reluctant to make that first investment. And so what we kind of learned from that is that you could actually have these sort of incremental improvements in rule of law and contract enforcement that could really get at this sort of underlying challenge. And what we wanted to understand is how this intersects with the challenges of finance. Now, let me tell you from our qualitative work what we understood about the financial. So we mapped out the financial access that female entrepreneurs face in Lusaka, and where they're getting a lot of their money. So generally it's hard to get credit. What's interesting, and they say that they don't have access to formal financial services, and that's quite the case. And they tend to rely, like in most parts of Africa, on informal banking arrangements, like these chilambas that actually Simone was talking about. Of course, if you use informal lenders, those have very high interest rates. And there is aspects of spousal consent. I'll get to those in a second. That said, I want to say one thing about this that actually, let me pull from here. We then talked to a lot of banking organizations. So we had interviews with all of the heads who were in fact trying to design formal financial products for women. And so they were understanding that it's an underserved constituency. There were actually significant businesswomen who were not actually lending from formal financial institutions. They were lending from these informal financial arrangements. And so one way I want you to think about these informal financial arrangements in Lusaka is that it's not only for the least educated or the least profitable businesses. It really is something that is being demanded by women at even higher levels of education and profits. So again, I think consistent with what Simone's finding, it's very, it's providing an additional need. And I think this goes back to security, which is interesting that the formal financial institutions have not been able to tap that quite well. And in fact, what they find is that there's an under demand for whatever products they have launched. And I do think it's because there are these other aspects of benefits that are coming. And I think that in the end, what we see is that there's sort of whatever's being offered in the market is not sufficient for the needs of female entrepreneurs. We, trying to think about where we have our comparative advantage and what we've learned from the previous quantitative work we did, we really wanted to say what could we do to be able to help sort of women to make that difference. And one other aspect I want to bring up, and then I'll sort of bring it together in terms of this risk of appropriation. So what we found is if you ask women where they get the majority of their money, 50% of women also rely on their husbands for investing in their business. In fact, sometimes they feel that they need their husbands to go to the bank with them, even though, as I showed you, there's not a formal spousal consent law. But in terms of, again, getting that kind of making sure you don't get taken advantage of, making sure you don't get given bad terms. For example, they find that bringing their husband helps them. And that's very difficult, even at higher levels of female entrepreneurship. And so, but what that means is women are very reluctant to do that because it means that the husbands will then be very involved in the business decisions of the business itself. And so they will lose the autonomy of of control over their businesses, and it creates intra-household challenges within the household. So this mixing of personal and business, as Anisha was saying, is absolutely happening here and is very challenging. But one thing that really, really helps these women is the of knowing that there would be some way of ensuring the security of their investments, the ability to get loans on good terms, and their ability to collaborate without fear of risk of expropriation. And that is these local institutions who are providing some form of contract enforcement. So these are the market chiefs and the small claims court. And so that was what we were working on exactly when the COVID pandemic hit, was how we can ensure that these local institutions are working for women, and they're providing the kind of security and enforcement that women are really looking for, and thereby allowing all of the aspects of the man's confidence in man to be able to be available for women. And then the COVID pandemic hit. So we have put that on hold, and in the process have taken advantage of this time period to see to what extent these fears are either increased or lessened by the COVID pandemic. And so we are currently in the field at the moment conducting phone surveys with two distinct groups of women that we've worked with. First is the female entrepreneurs that I just showed you about, and basically really looking at their coping strategies, their access to financial support and credit, their access to social support. So for example, these women who are within all of the chilambas, are they able to access, what are the channels in which, in the face of a shock, these are providing greater benefits for women. And the other aspect that we're looking at, so these are the entrepreneurs, and I don't know, Anisha, how much time we have. I'm concerned that I might be taking up too much of the time.
Maybe just this slide, because I know there are a lot of people who want to ask you questions.
I'll just wrap up right now. And we can go back to what we're exactly in the field trying to learn, and hopefully we'll have more to report for you in a month or two. But then the other aspect that we're able to look at, which is really exciting for me, is 4 years ago, we did a randomized control trial across all of Lusaka with 13-year-old girls, 5 years ago now. they have on teaching women, young women, negotiation skills. Those women have graduated, they're now moving into entrepreneurial activity, and we are able to now track them and look at the extent to which this additional, so that the negotiation training had a significant effect on their agency, their sense of agency, and their human capital accumulation. Now we can see to what extent that may actually affect their access to credit and what they do in terms of entrepreneurial activity and their fears of expropriation. And so we hope to soon have much more data to share with you.
Thanks so much, Nava. I think so many questions for you, even in my mind itself. I mean, even just from everything you've shared so far, I'd love to think of like how this would play out in other contexts as well, right? In Tanzania, in Kenya, in Simone's context, in the context that Caroline and Nathan are working, especially when you think of like institutions and how those also differ. And I think a lot of people also asked questions on how we think about enforcement and rule in different contexts. So that, but anyway, besides my points to ask, I think everybody in the audience, we'd love to take questions from you as well. If you could use the Q&A feature, please throw in your questions and I'll just sort of pose them to the people on the panel. To start, I think there was a couple of them that touched upon this, and maybe to know more from you, Nava, Simone, Caroline, well, Nathan, Alexia as well, like how should we really think about and conceptualize transformative in our minds, right? And when we try, and once we have this conceptual thought around it, how should we go about thinking of measuring impact? What should we really be focusing on? Is it women-focused indicators on empowerment? Is it access to finance, which is the indicator? Is it more to do with financial health or resilience as a community or as a household? So it would be good to hear your sort of thoughts on how should we conceptualize it in these settings, and then what should we really focus on as ways to measure it. I think Simone, Caroline, if you and Nava, if you have thoughts on that, and then Caroline, I think we'd also love to hear from you. We can come up with as many indicators and outcome measures as we'd like, but sort of what are the challenges you've actually noticed while trying to collect some of these indicators in the way that they're structured? Simone, would you like to go first?
It's such an interesting question and such a hard question. I feel like a number of people have, kind of written on this in the Q&A, and I think it's something I feel that I don't necessarily have the answer to, but I think it's interesting to reflect on. In that, there were I think some of the questions were like, do you think that, mobile money has a gender transformative effect? And, I think my view is that it's hard to answer that, I think in part because we started with this definition that I really almost view as more of like a guiding light. It's kind of like, where do we want women to go in their lives? And, that is to kind of be like like just sort of being able to realize all your talents and fully participate, kind of in society with agency and confidence. And that's a huge ask, I think, for almost any financial service product. But at the same time, if we're not working towards that goal, we're kind of selling ourselves short. And I think that it's also just like useful for, maybe like broadening our thinking about like what types of outcomes should we be considering, but at the same time, perhaps being a little realistic about, where in the theory of change we would expect these things to kick in. I think that one of the things I learned from the qualitative research, and these are huge, these are big things. And I think one of the things I learned in the qual research, and I think Leela should also speak to this, because I know in one of our emails to Martha or Jemima, she had this great analogy about house. But like these small changes can actually mean so much to women. just this idea of, I think the way that women articulate, before I was like completely dependent on my husband for everything. Like I had, I had no agency. And just that idea that like, okay, well now, like if my kid is hungry, I can buy some food and feed my kid. Like that's not going to register, I think, on most quantitative surveys, but like that's a profound shift in human well-being. So I don't know that I've answered, the question, but I kind of, I think of it as most financial services, certainly that we've seen, I always think of like as small steps in the right direction. And I don't know that, like I don't think that we should dismiss a product as a failure if that's all that you see, in part because those small steps can mean a lot, but you also don't want to kind of like throw out the broader objective. So I'll leave it at that and open the floor to, like, you know, Nava, Vila, and Caroline.
I so resonate with that. I think it's actually really crucial that when we think about impact, so I'll talk about the impact question first. I think it's very important that we measure subjective well-being and have, and that we use a lot more both qualitative elements in our research, and that even when we do quantitative surveys, that we have some of these measures of subjective well-being. Just to give you a sense of how important this is. So when we did work on fertility decisions in Zambia with married couples. So we had similar challenges to Nathan and Caroline. How do you get men to the trainings? How do you get them interested? And there actually, you know, the focus, it's kind of parallel. The focus was always in policy on access to contraceptives. And, you know, we provided access, and you would think, and women took it up when it was in private, for example, and they had less children. But we measured subjective well-being and they were less happy. And that gave us the clue that actually this is a second best option. We have to find a way to bring the men in and have them be involved, because family unity is absolutely a crucial aspect of well-being, especially in Zambia. And I think, you know, we can debate what values we care about in a Western context, what values women in Africa care about, but there's no question in my mind that when we start to study things like subjective well-being, we will have people's own definition of what means a good life for them. So I think, and we as economists have often been on the wrong track, both because we have our own cultural biases, because we come from a setting where maybe, you know, economic impact is well-being, but we need ways to measure these. And I would say if we can put them, if all of us should just put them in every quantitative survey we have, and basic things like how happy are you, how healthy are you, compared to how you were, those will give you the clues. And then I'll answer I just feel like it's a slightly different question, the transformative aspect. So I don't know if we want to more discuss the impact question.
Maybe we get Leela, thoughts from you. I think from a qualitative perspective, what are sort of the ways you've thought of having women define some of these terms themselves, right, and what it means to them, and then how do you go back and incorporate that into the research itself, and then use it to contextualize the findings? What have sort of your best practices or ways to make it work been so far?
I think, you know, like Simone said, the definition of transformative that we started with was kind of our, you know, it was just a starting point, and we wanted to, from the qualitative point of view, we wanted to get at that question from every angle that we could. So we had very long interviews. We also did focus groups with people just talking about what their lives looked like, what their aspirations were, what their expectations were for the future, for their children, and what place did financial services have in those life paths, basically. And I think, you know, if you, I went into the field, I had very little background on financial inclusion in particular in low-income countries. And you know, if you didn't know any better, you would think from these people's narratives that financial inclusion is very transformative to their lives, right? So I feel that, you know, talking to Simone and doing this work over the past year and a half, it dawned on me just how much of a disconnect there sometimes is between what economics measures and what qualitative finds when it goes, you know, out into the field. And just having the opportunity of doing this work together, I feel was really very interesting. I just, you know, I just think you cannot forget to go out and talk to people themselves about what it is that they want to accomplish every time they take up a product, or you offer them a product, or you have to develop a product, because you might find a way, you know, just tailoring the development of products to women's context and aspirations and needs and specific constraints and preferences is critical. And I think that what we did with the qualitative is get at some of those issues. Is what is it that is missing from the existing landscape? What might be things that they want? Someone was asking the question, did you only focus on informal services? Because the quotes, a lot of the ones that we selected for the presentation were about the chamas. And no, we didn't just focus on the informal, it just came up a lot. But what we didn't talk about in the interest of time is that there was also a lot of interest on formal products as well. And especially banks, people valued the security that a bank account might offer relative to, say, you know, saving with a chama and things like that. So there is so much to learn about what is, you know, where the gaps are and what we might be able to do in order to meet people's needs where they are.
Nathan and Caroline, I think from your research, anything to share as well?
So I just wanted to quickly echo this qualitative discussion. So Rachel Glenister, who's the chief economist at whatever DFID became, has written some blog posts on the importance of qualitative work and how economists don't do qualitative work, and we actually do, but we don't really talk about it. Unfortunately, she has a book on impact evaluation, on measuring these things. It's absolutely fantastic, but she never mentions qualitative work in that book. So I think training on this is really, really important. And I think from my perspective, it's really important to bring in qualitative experts into projects, because I really value the qualitative work, but don't want to pretend that I can do it to the quality that some people have. So we have a co-author on this paper that is very involved in qualitative work, and we're going to be doing some now, in part because we're also finding, and not to say too much about any results, because we don't really have any to share at this point, but the potential unintended consequences of some of this type of programming, I think, is very important to think through. And you cannot figure that out without a very good qualitative study. So this is partly what we're also, you know, thinking through. And I just want to make one last comment. I want to make a shout out to our co-author here, who's in the participants, and Catherine Schiffs from RWI in Berlin. We are actually running an experiment on subjective well-being. I do lots of little, this is for the nerds in the audience, you can probably tell I am one. I do a lot of experiments on methods when it comes to surveys. And so we actually have been varying location of subjective well-being questions within our surveys across 6 countries. And we do find that those answers do change quite a lot. So, you know, subjective well-being questions, I think, are important. I don't want to downplay them, but doing them very well can be a little bit difficult and needs to be done carefully. Caroline, please jump in now.
Thanks. No, I think I just wanted to echo and add that I think in thinking about what does transformative finance mean, I think it really is about agency and decision making. Is finance doing for you what you want it to? And I think when I think about our experiment anyway, you know, we have a private secret account that might be good for a woman who wants to keep her finances to herself and perhaps do it in a more secure way, as Leela was getting at. But then there may be women who inherently wish to engage with their husbands for kind of trust reasons or social norm reasons, kind of what others were getting at. So yeah, I think that's what I think about when I think about transformative finance anyway. And yeah, so kind of just echoing everyone else.
Nawa, do you want to share some thoughts on transformative?
Yeah, I think similar, parallel to what people are saying, we can't think of it outside the context. So we have the intra-household dynamics, which are very personal. We have the skills that women learn to take agency in their life. And then we have the institutions that they're embedded in. And I think we don't want to lose the institutional aspect too, because I think often as microeconomists too, we tend to focus on the smaller aspects. But you know, you can think about systems change that is not that hard to do. You know, gender norms are very hard to do. But one of the things that we've discovered with the kind of, accessing the small claims court or improving the unbiasedness of the market chief is that actually you can make these incremental changes in things that have to do with contract enforcement and rule of law that can actually make women entrepreneurs feel much safer. And we don't want to just only focus on these individual aspects when in fact there can be some system changes that we can be part of as well.
Yeah, I think it's the same point around each study and each financial service being a piece of the puzzle, right? Like even that way, the household, the husband, the family, the woman, the system, the institution, all of it is also a piece of the puzzle in making this gender transformative. I think one of the other questions that came up was around, and this was asked, I think, to Caroline and Nava as well, but I think there's a larger point here that I sort of wanted to pose to all the panelists. The question was around how does knowledge of the gender of the chief, or if chiefs in these areas are usually women or men, how does that impact it? And I think there was a similar question, Nava, for the lab in the field experiment that you mentioned. If you're coordinating between players, how do allocations differ depending on gender? And I think the same thing, Caroline, was for you, and like whether having two people show up to the training, how that affects it, and who knows about these trainings happening. So I think just generally, this also goes back to the provision of financial services, and like when mobile money agents or other agents on the ground, financial service agents might be women or men, and all the other decision makers who might be of either gender. I don't know if anyone on the panel, if you've done work around this, or if you have thoughts to share on how gender of the other person affects like the financial institution provider or sub agent on the ground or chief or enforcement party, how that might affect these indicators that we're talking about.
What I can jump in and just add about how we set up our intervention just in terms of those dynamics. In terms of delivering accounts to people, we worked with female bank agents, so that like a female bank agent was the one providing a bank account to our study respondents, and there was that gender matching and trust there, so that she could ask if she had questions about how to use it or how to make certain transactions. There was that comfort level there. But also interesting because in thinking about Nava's points about market chiefs and trusts, and thinking about how we were working in markets and we were engaging with market leaders to make introductions and things like that, like those are men. And I'm kind of thinking to myself, how will those impacts change if we're then surveying women in non-market areas? Perhaps like their level of underlying trust might differ. In terms of our training intervention, we also were cognizant of gender dynamics. So it was designed as a couples training. We really needed or wanted women to come with their husbands. You know, we were going to be talking about these intra-household dynamics and like very personal household decision making that goes on, hours spent in the day, and like what are your needs and wants, and what are my goals, what am I saving for? It really was meant to be a couples training. We did have the leader of the training were female facilitators, and then we had kind of co-assistant facilitators, men. So we had both men and women present in the training, though we did have a female be kind of the lead role there. So that was how we kind of addressed some of those gender dynamics in terms of the delivery of the intervention.
I'm going to turn to my better half in the paper to Alexia to answer.
No, I think I replied to some more technical points in the chat about this. So in the experiment, we kind of shut down this variation because the chief didn't know anything about the identity of the players, so it couldn't be gender biased. So we proposed access to a better version of the chief in the experiment, exactly to see what happens when people have access to an unbiased institution. So a better institution compared to what they have locally. It would be great to test it empirically. We just found one single female chief in Lusaka. And so we don't have variation on this margin. What we see for sure is that the impact of the chief, so on women's trust, is greater in those markets where women are more of a minority compared to those markets in which there's more balance in gender shares, which might hint at this, exactly like at these issues about intergender relationships. In terms of how to link this with access to finance, in the surveys that are right now in the field, we're asking some sort of scenarios questions in which we ask exactly about lenders. And suppose that you are interacting with a lender that could be a man or a woman. How would you reply if this lender offers you an interest rate which is unfair? Would you try to negotiate or not? And whether the gender of the lender really matters for this. So we really wanted to show you some preliminary results today about this, because that's exactly along the lines that we're thinking about.
Yeah, we'd love to get that one as well when it comes in. Okay, I think there was also a question around how can we bring this all together, and between FSPs and civil society and researchers, but I know that's a big one that is a sort of black hole that we can get very deep into. So before that, I think there was one more question that I sort of wanted to pose to the panelists here, and that a lot of us spoke today on the positive impacts or the positive effects of transformative financial inclusion. I think, Simone, you did touch on the point of gender violence and gender-based violence and how what the, if any, effects there were there. I think Alison asks, even amongst women users who might turn out to be more reliant debtors, so how can we sort of make this trade-off in research and look at both potential harms and risks, and do we do enough maybe to look at both? I don't know, Simone, Nathan, Nava, would you just like to share thoughts?
I think that that's a really excellent and super important question. You know, in that one, we really should be honest in the business of trying to understand if things have unintended consequences. I think Nava's, you know, kind of contraceptive example is a great one. You know, and to be honest, that like sometimes products can have both positive and negative effects, right? So I didn't plan my time well enough to spend time on the unintended consequences slide, but you know, while women report that, you know, kind of having access to finance, you know, kind of increases their agency and ability to do stuff for their household, like it can create conflicts between spouses. It's not clear, you know, the extent, and you may never be able to completely mitigate that. And so I think we really want to be understanding kind of the relative magnitudes of some of these shifts. And, you know, similarly, a lot of products can do positive and negative things for different people. I think another thing that, you know, women kind of talked about with the informal groups, which have, you know, all these huge benefits, I think, especially in terms of building social capital for people who might otherwise be isolated, is that there's a tremendous pressure to repay. It's part of why the groups work and part of why it's sustainable. So that social pressure is valuable, but it can be like extremely stressful. And, you know, kind of, especially now, you know, in Kenya, like sort of mobile, like sort of fast mobile loans are becoming really popular. It's happening in other African countries as well. I think like Taveen and Billy actually have some research that shows that this actually does kind of, doesn't seem, you know, on average, it seems to be helping people and that they can kind of smooth consumption. But, you know, some women report this is like drawing me into a debt cycle where I have to pay my chama because they are my friends and I can't let them down. So I take, you know, a loan on one mobile platform, but then that comes due and I take another, and this is incredibly stressful. So, you know, this is all to say that we need to be very honest with ourselves, I think, about the fact that there can be these unintended consequences, and, you know, think very seriously about ways to mitigate them, and also to understand, you know, I think with a lot of products, like some people are going to benefit a lot and some people are not going to benefit very much or may be harmed. And so, you know, kind of how do we get the right tool to the right person?
Yeah. Just in the interest of time, I think there are a lot of interesting perspectives that we can hear on that as well, but maybe as we're heading into the last 7-8 minutes of this, I think going back to the question on how can financial service providers, civil society, researchers, policymakers, grant organizations, what can we all do to come together? Maybe Dr. Martha, maybe now's a nice time for you to share your thoughts. Dr. Martha is a senior program specialist at IDRC. I mean, I think you're probably best placed to share where you think the future of transformative finance is for women. What should we be thinking about? What have we missed? And like, what should our focus areas for next year be? And how can we really leverage all these pieces to come together towards that larger theory of change, long-term impact goal? I think you're on mute as well. Dr. Martha, you're on mute. We can't hear you yet. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be part of this very rich and insightful webinar. I've learned a lot from the presentations and the Q&A. I would like to offer a few concluding thoughts based on what we've just heard on how we can push the needle towards a more gender transformative financial inclusion, and really bringing some of the discussion together in a way that we see us and how research can move this agenda forward. First, I think it's important to take a step back and ask a very basic question. Why the focus on women's financial inclusion? And some of you have alluded to this, and we all know that despite significant progress in financial inclusion around the world, gender gaps remain, right? And millions of marginalized women are still left out. And COVID-19 is likely to widen this gap. Financial inclusion remains a major constraint to achieving SDG goals on gender equality, but the current pandemic has added urgency for action, I would say. We know women are hit the hardest by the pandemic. We have learned from the Ebola crisis in West Africa and from others before it that women suffer greater economic losses in a pandemic and that their incomes take longer to return to normal. So financial inclusion can be a lifeline for millions of women-owned businesses, which are by and large informal with no safeguards. And whether it is transformative or not, it is very important, particularly at this point of time. So it's well recognized that financial inclusion can be a key enabler to women's economic empowerment. But we also know that this is not automatic, as we've just heard. And the question we've been grappling is, what does it take to make this a reality? For the past decade, the focus has primarily been on improving women's access to financial products and services, and all bets were on access. And the research supported by IDRC and others in the more recent years, including the ones we've just heard, is gathering evidence that access to finance alone may not be transformative and that gender barriers need to be addressed in tandem. And what are these barriers? One key barrier that we've heard consistently across the panelists is social and cultural norms, which ascribes roles, rights, and responsibilities of what's considered appropriate for men and women, boys and girls in different contexts. And these shape opportunities people have in advancing their education, the type and nature of work they do, the type and nature of assets they accumulate, etc. And as a result, women are more likely to operate from home, in part because of their responsibilities at home. On average, we know that women spend almost 5 hours a day during unpaid care work, while men spend only an hour and a half doing the same. This has implications on the kinds of economic activities women are able to engage in and their earning potential, among others. And other barriers also mentioned in the panel include the lack of land rights and productive assets, low financial literacy among women, and lack of trust in financial institutions. Why do these barriers matter for financial inclusion? I think, as we've heard, a mere focus on women without understanding the broader gender-based barriers that affect their access to or use of financial products and services could limit the usefulness of the very financial innovations that are meant to help them. Whether it is gender norms, lack of financial literacy, lack of information, or trust in financial institutions, we need to recognize the barriers that hold back women from accessing as well as benefiting from the financial offering. And as we've heard, our work is providing evidence on that social and cultural norms determine women's control over their own resources, as well as their ability to make use of their financial products. The work has also highlighted that not taking these and intra-household relations into account can reduce the effectiveness and impact of intervention. It can also lead to unintended negative consequences, which was just mentioned now. And we're testing what interventions can help shift these norms in a positive way and what can be sustained. And as efforts to close gender gaps in financial inclusion continue to mount, there are important questions that are emerging and continue to linger. Are the financial tools available to women helping them enhance their productivity and income? Is the financial inclusion transformative by itself, or does it need to be coupled with other interventions to have a demonstrable positive impact on the livelihoods of the people it targets? We believe at IDRC that research can play an important role by documenting what works, what doesn't, and why in various contexts. We are investing in building knowledge leaders that contribute to finding local solutions. And this webinar highlighted a small part of our work that are making important contributions to understanding the ways in which the transformative potential of financial innovations can be enhanced. And I will end by saying that a key message that rings loud in these and other similar research on financial inclusion that we've supported over the years is that financial inclusion is not an end in itself. It is a means of improving livelihoods and fostering women's economic empowerment. But for financial inclusion to fulfill this role, we need to rethink our approach. We need to go beyond access and shift the focus to how this can be an instrument for transforming lives. This needs to be an integral part of efforts to build back better during and after the COVID pandemic as well. And I will conclude with a quote from a recent IDRC supported study that Anisha actually started us in the opening remark, which is gender transformative financial inclusion is not about making women bankable, but rather it is about making financial systems women able. Thank you so much for this rich discussion. I look forward to further engaging with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Since you ended with what I started with, I think we've come full circle here. Thank you all for joining, all the panelists, all the participants. Please do feel free to send in any questions. Of course, I think Simone and Nava already shared their report links, but we'll also be putting up a recording of the webinar and sharing that with everybody who joined today. So thank you so much all. Have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.